Ms. Clark, thank you so much for taking the time. So you officially announced your candidacy for Secretary General of the United Nations in April, and you already had several rounds of interviews. How did it go?
I announced on the 4th of April, and on the 14th of April I had the big job interview with the General Assembly. And in 2 hours I was asked something like 109 questions, which I did my best to answer. After that, I began visits to Security Council capitals, and by the end of this week I will have been to 13 of 15. I've also come to Berlin, which is a very important international capital, and Germany makes a huge contribution to the United Nations, so it's good to come and speak to people here as well. The action shifts to the Security Council next month when they start some of the first consideration of the candidacies.
You would become the first woman in the role of the world's top diplomat. Does gender matter this time?
Well, many member states are saying it matters a lot. They're saying after almost 71 years, isn't it time? I think it is very important to focus on what are the skills for the job and who's the best person for the job. Obviously, I hope it will be me. I am a woman, and clearly that breaks a big glass ceiling.
This marks the first time that the Secretary General is chosen with a minimum of transparency and not behind closed doors. For your application, you actually had to write an essay, you had to face questions from the public. So what did you learn from this process?
Well, firstly, I welcome the process. In the past, it's been very much closed doors and really not even a particularly open application process. Sometimes candidates have emerged from the closets, as it were, very, very close to the determination of who the selected candidate would be. But this time, yes, we supplied our vision statement, we went to the General Assembly, the member states were able to ask any question of us. This is good, and it gives people some idea of who it is who could be the next Secretary General.
And what did they learn from you?
Well, I think what they learned from me was that I bring to this all the skills of a former Prime Minister, someone who has been operating as a national leader, a regional leader, and of course these last 7 years leading the development pillar of the United Nations with a global perspective, tremendous amount of engagement in Africa and across all developing regions, and very close engagement with developed countries whom we depend on for the bulk of the funding for our organisations. So I'm a candidate with global reach, with a global profile, and I think it's leadership skills that are needed now for the UN to step up to the very serious challenges the world faces, which the UN is expected to try to bring some resolution to.
Which actually brings me to my next question. What do you think are the toughest challenges that the United Nations and the world therefore faces?
So there's huge issues still with some 900 million people living in extreme poverty. This is a stain on the conscience of the world in the 21st century. There are the environmental crises. Obviously climate change is a huge challenge, and with it go the threats to biodiversity, many consequences. Then we have these ghastly conflicts which are protracted, causing so much misery. Latest figures from the UN Refugee Agency talking about 65 million forcibly displaced people in our world. So those are the problems. Now, on the solutions, I think the Paris Agreement on climate change is a great step forward, got to be implemented. The Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, great step forward, got to be implemented. I've spent the last 7 years working on these issues. They're my bread and butter. I think where the next Secretary General really needs to put priority is on the nature of conflict facing our world today. This is not the world of 1945 when world leaders said, let's have an international organisation which can stop the scourge of war affecting future generations. By and large, we've stopped wars between nations. But have we stopped war? No, we haven't. We have these horrible civil wars. We have the violent extremists. We have the terrorists. We have the violent criminals. We have so many threats to peace and security. This is where I think huge priority now needs to go.
You mentioned the refugee crisis. Some call it the biggest crisis of our times. How would you tackle that?
Well, it's a huge crisis, but I think we need to look at the underlying drivers of it. What are people fleeing from? Those coming in through the eastern route to Europe from Turkey, They're fleeing from Syria, a nation in conflict. They're fleeing from Afghanistan, a very fragile nation with huge insecurity and great poverty. Then we look at the flow coming in through Libya into Italy and Malta predominantly. This has some elements of a flight from fear and conflict, but overwhelmingly it's a flight from poverty and lack of opportunity. And there are very clear development responses to that. So I think it's time to be looking at some of the root causes. Otherwise we're just trying to put a sticking plaster over a very, very serious set of problems. And for Syria, the root cause is the war. The war needs to stop. It needs a political settlement.
Many member states, including Germany and Japan, want a reform of the Security Council. If you were to become the next Secretary General, would you reduce the power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council?
Well, there's some things Secretary Generals can do and some they can't. And removing vetoes is definitely one that's well beyond the province of the Secretary General. In fact, even saying what the shape of the Security Council should be is not the job of the Secretary General. What I would say is that the Security Council reflects the post-war settlement of 1945. Here we are, almost 71 years later. The world has changed a great deal. And for the UN to stay relevant and responsive to today's world, it needs to review its architecture. Now, as Secretary General, I'm very happy to facilitate that discussion among the member states. The member states must take the decision. But I think uppermost in everybody's mind is, how do we keep this great organisation relevant? I think there's also issues on the effectiveness and efficiency front, and I like to see myself as someone out of New Zealand with a modern approach to public administration, running well-oiled machines to get results as well, and I'd like to bring that touch to the UN Secretariat.
That is a very diplomatic answer. Experts and member states alike criticize that the UN is ponderous and too bureaucratic. So what would you make a priority? What would be your first reform?
Well, talking to a very wide range of member states, there is frustration with some of the clunkiness of the UN administration. For example, it takes a long time to deploy civilians to peacekeeping missions. Actually takes quite a long time to fill jobs in general. It just takes a long time to do things, and some of the systems don't work so well. Now in UNDP, I've had a big drive for less bureaucracy, fewer layers of management, getting people closer to the countries that they serve by pushing regionalisation of the organisation. I know at UNDP it can be done. You have to be pretty clear-sighted and firm to get it done. But I think the Secretariat is calling for some of that kind of prioritisation, a relook at how resources are allocated. You can't keep running back to member states for more money all the time. At some point they say, well, how are you spending the money you've got? And you have to have a good look at that.
After concluding your time as Prime Minister of New Zealand, you became the administrator of the UN Development Programme. What did you learn at the UNDP that prepared you for the position as Secretary General?
Well, I think incredibly well, because UNDP sits at the intersection of so much of the UN's work. We are the overarching development agency. We lead the UN development system. We work not only across poverty eradication and environment, including very much on climate change, but we're at the intersection of peace and security. How do you build peaceful and more inclusive societies with the rule of law, with voice for people, the kinds of societies that talk their differences out, not fight them out. And I am driven by a desire to see people use jaw, not war, when it comes to sorting out the future of a country. So this has given me perspectives on how development can contribute to building the more peaceful world that the UN Charter envisages. And I think I can bring a lot of these perspectives, as well as having been a national and regional leader, into the position of Secretary General.
What would you consider your biggest accomplishment within the development sector from the past years?
Well, I think being action-oriented to get results. You don't put in all this effort, have $5 billion a year go through the organisation, not to want to have something to show for it. Now, in the sort of work UNDP does, supporting elections, building the capacity of public administration, rule of law, it hasn't always been as easy to count results as perhaps it is in the humanitarian world, where you can count the number of food parcels and the number of tents erected. But we have made a huge effort with modern strategic planning, allocation of resources, measuring results to show what we do. And this has been really very much welcomed by the member states of the UN who sit on our board, who see UNDP sharpening itself up to meet the challenges and show that it gets results. I think that's an accomplishment.
Looking at the process, at the election process, some worry that this will be decided again behind closed doors even after this application process. How do you see your chances? How high are your chances?
Well, I think it depends on what the member states are looking for in the end, and I refer particularly to the 15 on the Security Council, and of course the permanent 5 have a particular level of influence in this. If they are looking for the best person for the job in our troubled and challenging world, I believe they will look to a profile like mine. If the attitude is going to be, oh well, it's some region's turn so we only look there, then that's another matter. But I think what the UN needs is someone who can lift it to another level. What would be the worst thing that can happen? That the UN slips into irrelevance as a player in the world in which we live. If we didn't have the UN, we'd have to invent it. So can we please reinvent it now to make it more relevant and more effective? And that will require the leadership skills of someone like myself.
Thank you so much, Ms. Clark. Good luck with your campaign.
Thank you.